Okay. No? Hello? Good? Okay. Hello, can everybody hear me? Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome. And I was going to say, if anybody feels like, coming a little closer so we can have a bit more of an intimate discussion, that'd be great. So we're here with a fantastic panel, all raring to go. We're going to be talking about green buildings. I'm just going to introduce the panel very briefly. I'll make a couple of remarks, and then we're just going to go straight into a panel discussion. So I'm going to start over here. We have Martha Johnson, who is the administrator for the GSA, which is the US General Services Administration. We have Rachel Gutter, who's director of the Center for Green Schools, which is part of the US Green Building Council. We have David Orr, who is, I'm sure a lot of you know, he's Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics at Oberlin College. And here we have Chuck Kutcher, who's at the National Renewable Energy Lab. So welcome, everybody. And what I was going to say, I mean, it's interesting that we've got the billing for this program says a moon base on the Earth, and looks rather like we've got something, we're going to be talking about these very sort of high-tech buildings and sort of cutting-edge stuff. I mean, one of the points I'd just like to make before we get started is that I think when it comes to sort of green buildings, we're perhaps talking less about those sort of very sexy cutting-edge projects. We're really talking about the existing space that we all, we all live in a building, and it probably could be a lot greener. Just one sort of statistic, a lot of us have got these, we're seeing these 2030 targets. Well, in New York, where I live, by 2030, existing structures will still make up 85% of the built environment. So, this is the bulk of our challenge here with green buildings. And the second point I'd like to make is a sort of very personal one, which is that I'm in a 25-story building with sort of a couple of hundred apartments in. It was built in the 1960s, right in the middle of Manhattan, and we're actually trying to do a green building program ourselves. I by the way, write about this for the Financial Times. I write about sustainable business, and so I have covered green buildings a bit. So for me, it's very interesting because I'm now looking at it in a very practical context, which is the building I live in. And what really struck me getting into this was that we've got this marvelous ground plan. We had a consultant come in and produce a footprint of the building and recommendations of what we had to do. And then, you just run up against these hurdles. So, I sit on the board and I talk about these things, and they say, yes, but, we've got to spend money on this first and that first and the other first. And, well, if we do, sub-metering, isn't it going to cost us all a lot more money? And I'm going, well, no, but it's going to save you a lot more money in the long run. But it's it's often a very hard case to make. So I think the real challenge is not coming up with the next, space-age building. I think it's much more to do with how do we manage what we've actually got. But I'm actually going to start with a sort of big question, and I'm going to put it to all of you, and you'll probably all have different answers to it. We have a lot of, as I say, these targets. A lot of them are for 2030, 2050, whatever. People are talking about going carbon neutral or having a carbon neutral building. And my question is, what does that really mean? What are we talking about here? How far are you measuring this? How can we possibly get to zero carbon? Is that actually a reality, or is that just a bit of sort of greenwashing talk? So I'm going to start with Chuck, because Chuck told me earlier that you're working on a zero energy building. So just in your perspective, what does carbon neutral mean to you, and is it something that's achievable?
Okay, well, thanks very much. Yeah, I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, and I've worked there since 1978, and for so many years, we were all in just leased office space. In the last few years, we've grown. Our budget has gone up. It remains to be seen what happens next year. But in any case, we've been building new buildings. And the folks that work in our commercial buildings group have been quite involved in developing of these new buildings. And the latest one that recently became dedicated and occupied is called the RSF, the Research Support Facility. It's a LEED Platinum building. It's a zero energy building. And so, you can argue what the difference between zero energy and zero carbon means, but I think if you're not using any net energy, you're doing pretty good from a carbon standpoint. For those of you that went to the plenary session this morning, there was a lot of talk about climate change. And it turns out that buildings in the U.S. Account for about 43% of U.S. carbon emissions. So if we can, and of course that is from the energy use, if we can lower the energy use of buildings, we can make a huge dent in terms of our carbon emissions. That's what we've attempted to do in this zero energy building. And so that's been achieved, and essentially, it's made very energy efficient. I've got a list here of all the different features, but it's not just one thing. It's many, many different things. It's for one thing, it's just good building design. If you go back to Victor Olgay's very classic book, Design with Climate, that was published in 1963, just some of the basic principles like having the long axis be east-west, taking advantage of the sunlight. This building does that. It uses passive solar heating. It uses lots of daylighting. If you can use daylighting, you accomplish a couple different things. For one thing, you cut down the lighting load, the electricity used for lighting. At the same time, sunlight is much more optically efficient than artificial light. And so when you use daylighting, you cut down on the building cooling loads as well. We also find that productivity goes up. There have been many studies in schools and workplaces that find absenteeism goes down, productivity goes up, even when they ask the workers. So there's a lot of daylighting in this building. Of course, there's energy efficient windows. There's plenty of insulation, energy efficient lights, task lighting. No desktop computers, all laptop computers. Laptop computers use much less energy than a desktop computer. Very low energy monitors, no local printers. We don't have printers at our desks. Now, it's an open office environment, and particularly for older folks like me, it takes a little getting used to. The guy next to you says something on the phone, and you think he's talking to you. I find the younger people all sit there with their ear pods in, listening to music, working happily away. Those of us that have trouble listening to music and working, it's more of a challenge. But in this building, there's nobody more than 30 feet away from a window. And so the cubicles are very low walls. It really does facilitate people working together, but it does take some getting used to. Because of the daylighting, there are some issues with glare that have to be addressed. They're working on that. But basically, when they do surveys, people seem to be very happy in these buildings. Now, to get zero energy, of course, you can cut down the amount of energy using through all these different features. We preheat the ventilation air using transpired solar collector walls, a technology that I was involved in developing in the 1990s, and various other means. We take waste heat from the data center and use that for building heating. But to really get net zero energy, you need some energy source. And so we have close to a megawatt of photovoltaics on the building rooftop and on a canopy that's covering the parking lot. So that's how we achieve zero energy in that building.
Thanks a lot. Mm-hmm. Well, I think the renewable energy is a key point because, we're using so much energy, it's got to be generated from some other place. I mean, one of the points I think is interesting about this as well is some of the sort of legislative barriers that you get to this, in that, in some places you can put a solar panel on your roof and you can generate energy, but if you have got certain types of tenants in the building, you can't use it because you can't sell it to them because you're not a utility. So, I mean, I think there's, again, it's not just about technology, is it? It's about the sort of complex systems that interlink with this. I'm going to go to Martha here because I've got lovely big figures, which I hope I noted down correctly, of the building footprint that you are, responsible for. So 190 million square foot of leased office space, 170 million square foot of owned office space, which I think totals something like 2% of the entire US commercial office space. So when you're managing a footprint that big, what does zero energy or zero carbon mean in that context?
Thank you. The General Services Administration does have a huge footprint that we need to worry about, and much of it is office space, but it's also labs, border stations, just a whole host of different kinds of buildings. So we have a challenge in thinking about the use of the building and the mission of the organization we're supporting. We are on a real drive to be sure that the federal inventory is efficient. We've been on this drive since the 70s, when the oil crisis of the 70s sort of presented it first. And we put the first green roof on in 1974 in a building in Portland, and it still hasn't leaked. So we've been sort of working this issue for quite a while. And I think I can say that we have some buildings that we're aiming for and that are zero. in terms of being able to produce the energy that they need from photovoltaics and a whole bunch of things, geothermal and so on. But we certainly have a big piece of the inventory we're still working on. There are a couple of things I think we should understand, and that I'm not going to speak so much to the technology as I'm going to speak to the behavior and the mission and the people and the culture of what's going on in the buildings, because the shell is one thing, and then it's the activity within as well as the behaviors and understanding. There are some people that say we don't have to build another office building for 20 years. We have the stock in the country. We are not using our buildings in any kind of way that is really maximizing the buildings. The turnstile at our own headquarters is barely 50% on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. It's more like 30% on Monday and Friday. That's not unusual. 40% is something in the 40s is what industry reports, which means we are heating and cooling and paying for twice the building space that we need. Now, that's a lovely statistic to have, but what do you do when you say to all the people in the building, gee, density is what we're after, and we're starting to deal with all the behaviors and the concerns of people who don't like to be crowded or have different assumptions about what personal space is and so on. But that is where we feel we can play a pretty strong role in helping the government think about how it's doing its work. So we are really engaged in issues around mobile work, virtual work, helping people understand the difference between personal space and private space. And frankly, private space is what you should be able to demand at work. You need to have a place where you can go if you need to be working in private or making a private phone call. But we do not really want in the future for everybody to feel they have personal space, meaning they own a space. It's their real estate and they get to put their name tag on it. These are huge shifts for people, especially a workforce that is not really well rewarded on any other measure. You sort of don't want to take away what they do have, which is a little bit of space to work in. So we're in a very interesting time of change and challenge. Technology is really helpful in this because as we have been introducing in the government, it's called telework, such government language, the notion of being able to work anywhere. Your work is what you do, not where you are, kind of a notion. We're really unpacking a lot of those basic questions. What is the government about? What are we doing? Who do we need to do it with? Where do we need to be? And we're having a lot of fun with that. We've been promoting our own teleworking notions and learning a lot about how much money people save when they don't have to trail into a federal office building, but they could work at home or work at the local Starbucks. We are also, so we're sort of surfacing those kinds of lessons about virtual work in the federal workspace and sharing those. But let me just tell you one other story about how we're trying to model this as GSA, because I think it is one thing to go out and tell the government how it's supposed to work, but we really need to do it ourselves. And we need to be innovating on ourselves and taking the risk and learning the lessons. We have a large historic office building that is our central headquarters in Washington. It's 2 blocks from the White House. It's a block-sized building. It was built in the 19-teens, and it is an E shape. In those days, it was a very progressive building. It had water fountains, the first building with water fountains in DC, and it's built so there's nice cross ventilation and sunlight and so on. We've been in this building ever since, and it's kind of long in the tooth, to be generous. And so we received Recovery Act money to rebuild this building and to renovate it. And in the process of doing that, we have to move everyone out of the building so we can be doing that work. And it's a historic building, so it takes a lot of time and a lot of very careful work. 2,000 people were in the building. They've moved out into swing space. And we're learning and having some practice in some of these open spaces and some of these other kinds of more modern environments. When we move back into the building, we will be taking 6,000 people back into the building. And frankly, that's not really that hard because of this 40% occupancy. But it gives us a chance to really make the point that all of GSA can be in one building. We're going to have to work very differently. We're going to have to be much more collaborative. We might have to talk to each other more often. We might need to have better technology, and we need to upgrade on a number of fronts. But I think it's going to be very important for the government to see that we can do that. If you've ever gone to the Hill, been in that Capitol building or been anywhere near the White House, they are in just postage stamp sized rooms because what they do is they keep chopping the space up and cramming people in. We're trying to say, no, you don't have to do that. You can do something very different to have an effective workspace. So I'll stop with that.
It's interesting, that point, because it sounds like, from what you're saying, if you succeed in this project, we may actually not need to worry about these flashy new green buildings. We just have to, we can deal with the ones that we've actually got. You know, if you're able to put 3 times as many people in the same building, you know.
Well, it is certainly a lever that we need to be exploring hard. That isn't to say that those buildings, if they have more people in them, are energy efficient. But we certainly, to reduce your environmental footprint, you need to reduce your footprint. Yeah. So that's the first line of attack.
Absolutely. I'm just going to go back again to the carbon neutral thing, Rachel, because we were talking about this earlier, and I think, you know, and you're very much involved in the education side of this, so how do we get people thinking about this in the future? Do you think, do you see carbon neutral as a sort of realistic target? And how can we be carbon neutral when every piece of equipment we bring into a building has embedded carbon in it? I mean, I think, Martha, you were telling me yesterday that you get rid of 10,000 computers a week. And so you're obviously bringing in the computers as well. They've all got embedded carbon in them. You know, how far do we go in the chain in measuring carbon, and how useful is that?
Yeah, so I think there's a really important distinction to be made between net zero and carbon neutral. I see net zero as something that can be done at an individual level. It's a commitment that can be made on the part of a building owner. But carbon neutrality is really a system level commitment, and as Martha was saying, it's about the people who are occupying it. That building is only going to be as efficient, as carbon neutral as the way that the occupants are engaging with the space. So I really see carbon neutrality as it necessarily needs to be a community level commitment and engagement, because you know, my world is schools, so at the center we're focused on K-12 and higher education. And you know, when you think about it, that school's only as green as, you know, the teachers, and whether they, you know, open the windows when the heating's on too high. And it's only as carbon neutral as the parents who individually bring their kids to school in massive SUVs. So, you know, there's got to be a community level engagement around carbon neutrality. And when you actually start expanding that, it goes beyond the school, beyond the community. It's really, you know, not to make it so big and overwhelming, but it's a national level requirement, and at some point a global one too. But in my mind, though, so net zero is something we can be working towards right now, and in fact, many are achieving it. The first net zero school just went up in Turkey Foot, Kentucky. So we know that we can generate as much energy as we're consuming. I think the carbon neutrality requires a shift in the way that we think about our surroundings and how we engage in them as a part of a greater whole. So our mission at the center is focused on how a green building, a net zero building, can educate a new generation of what we call sustainability natives, you know, students who are fluent in green, who inherently make greener choices. It's it's Charlotte at age 7 who slips the note under dad's door that says you've exceeded the 5-minute shower limit. You know, it's your kids who hassle you about, you know, using a plastic bottle or not bringing a reusable bag to the grocery store. I mean, that I think is the kind of shift. Every little thing that I do actually impacts the whole, that I think is necessary to move us towards carbon neutrality. I don't think that carbon neutrality is something that we're going to see happen in this generation.
It's interesting. I mean, you know, the terminology I think is sometimes very confusing, and I think, I mean, I've certainly, writing about the corporate world, I see a lot of companies throwing around this term, we're going to be carbon neutral in 10 years' time, and I'm thinking, you know, really? So I think there's a lot of sort of misconceptions around that. David, I mean, you're also you know, very much promoting this idea of how do we engage people in this stuff, and how you know, how you can do it at the same time and get people to actually understand it on a very real level. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that at the Oberlin project.
Well, 2 comments before I start. The term carbon neutral makes me a little nervous as a carbon-based life form. Right. So that is one way to get to carbon neutrality. Is just the second thing, I think the context for this panel is really interesting, because you couldn't have had this panel 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, certainly. And the success stories of Martha's leadership at GSA and Rachel and the old USGBC, these are amazing stories. And you couldn't have projected that at the beginning. I went to one of the early meetings to form the U.S. Green Building Council and went to the first conference where we had a couple hundred people, and it's just grown. I mean, this is a huge success story. And NREL as well. I mean, we partnered with NREL in the early days of the Lewis Center. And so I think we ought to congratulate ourselves on how far we've come. And the 2030 challenge that Ed Masria has pushed, and it's been adopted by USGBC and AIA and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of movement. And if you ask the question, can we power buildings can you create net zero buildings? The answer is yes. Yeah, we can do that. We know how to do that. And it's not so much a technical issue any longer. It's a leadership issue. It's a vision issue. And I don't even think it's an economic issue in any serious way, because if you do life cycle costing, then these things pay back. And there's no good argument for not doing green. In one study that we helped to fund, the foundation I work for on the side, the long story short of that particular report was the deeper the green, the better the economics. On how you get people engaged in this, we had an interesting breakfast conversation. And on one side, there's one view is, if you tell the truth about climate change and you report back what, say, Dennis Dimmick's talk yesterday and some of the other talks, you depress people. On the other side, if you engage in what Gus Speth, the former dean at the environmental school at Yale, calls happy talk, you're not telling the truth to the public. And that's not really where we want to be. We'd be the first movement anywhere not to tell the truth to the public about what's going on. So I think it does put us in kind of a bind. Within the Oberlin Project, long story short, we have 4 or 5 big goals. And the term the Oberlin Project is an umbrella phrase that describes each of these goals, and there are sub-goals below that. One is to rebuild a downtown. And using a 13-acre block that the college owns right in the middle of downtown Oberlin, we're a little city of 10,000 people. Located dead center Rust Belt. We're 75 miles from Detroit, 35 from Cleveland. But we want to be able to rebuild the downtown and use the 13-acre block as the economic driver in that process. Secondly, we want to be able to get to carbon neutrality for the city and the college. So if you put a compass down on our town square, draw a radius or circle with a radius of about 8 miles, that's our target focus. Third is to do all this as part of an educational venture, the same way we did the Lewis building 10 years ago. And Rachel's going to be helping us with part of this with this new school that's being planned for Oberlin. And the fourth goal is to build a 20,000-acre green belt around the city for agriculture and forestry. The fifth goal is to figure out how to replicate this around the country, and that's another conversation, but we want this to go viral. So we've organized, to answer your question specifically, we've organized the community into 10 teams: economics, education, community development, policy, and so forth. We have outside consultants that are working with us on each of those areas. And back to the issue of, what do you tell the public? In a way, you don't tell them anything. You let the public, and I know Rachel said this well this morning, you don't fight those battles in some ways. If you don't believe in climate change now, and by the way, belief in climate change, if you ask somebody, do you believe in Jesus, Moses, Buddha, that's belief. But you don't often hear somebody say, I just don't believe in the law of gravity, That's science. If you don't believe in the law of gravity, come to the top of the building with me and let's check it out. You go first, But anyway, that's another matter. But what we've done is to organize the community. We had about 150 people around the small community engaged in one or more of those particular teams. And there are 2 things that come through this to me, and I'll close with this. I think there is a huge amount of creativity at the grassroots in this country. And it's a little bit like having a pressure cooker with the heat turned up and the lid on. There is just a lot of pressure at the bottom of the society. And secondly, I think people are looking for leadership. They're looking for ways to engage issues. We have as many, I think I'm correct, in one of our groups, we have as many Tea Party members and right-wing, people who describe themselves as right-wingers, working to solarize the community, because that's a cool thing to do. And you can be an ardent right-winger and want to solarize for different reasons than maybe I want to do it. But to engage people in actually doing something. And there's something about the actual movement. Get away from talking about this stuff and fighting about battles. get engaged in this, and we're calling this, the phrase owes to a friend of mine, Patrick Doherty at the New America Foundation. It's called full spectrum sustainability. And what that is a fancy way to describe a whole lot of conversations that you normally don't have, and engaging people in those kind of conversations. So far, so good. But it's a strategy not of argumentation, but of engagement.
Interesting. I'm going to move on from the carbon point now. Is to green buildings are about much more than energy. Chuck, obviously you're involved in the energy side, but where does this interact with what I call broadly resource efficiency? How do we need to be thinking about how energy interacts with our water use in buildings, with waste management, with all those sorts of things? Is that something that you've found with this zero carbon building?
Well, it's actually, the RSF is not really a zero carbon, it's a zero net energy building.
Right.
By virtue of the PV that's been added. Certainly it uses a lot of recycled materials. Probably people are aware that we have a lot of beetle kill pine in Colorado. Well, we not only use wood chips from that beetle kill pine to run a wood chip plant that heats the hot water for our campus, but in fact some of the wood used in the building is actually from beetle kill, and there's other recycled materials that are used. As far as water goes, we've done some interesting studies on that. This building uses, the building I was talking about uses evaporative cooling. And in any dry climate, Colorado is certainly a dry climate, evaporative cooling can make a lot of sense. In fact, some of our buildings use what's called a combination of direct and indirect evaporative cooling, and I won't go into the details of that, but basically if you're familiar with a swamp cooler that appears on a lot of rooftops, basically you're running the air through evaporative pads, it cools down, and you cool the building that way. And we're using quite a bit of evaporative cooling. Now, one of the things that's come up is, well, gosh, isn't that a problem with water use? You're using water, and a lot of dry climates, water is an issue. Well, a study that was done at NREL looked at water use and found that if you run a vapor compression air conditioner that's air cooled, but if you look at the source of electricity and you look at the coal plant or whatever power plant it came from, it's 95% a water cooled plant. And so there's water use associated with that electricity. And so in fact, if you use the evaporative cooling, you wind up actually using less water than you do if you use the central electricity to run a vapor compression unit. So this gets back to this whole argument about where you draw the system boundary. And it's true for energy, it's true for water, it's true for carbon. You can get different results depending on where you draw that boundary. I'd like to add one other thing, though, about a zero net energy building. If let's switch for a minute and talk about homes, residences. Right now, to build a zero net energy home or to retrofit your home to be zero net energy, you need a way to produce energy, and that means photovoltaics typically, okay? It costs money. PV's coming way down in price. That's great. But actually, you don't need to build a zero net energy home or retrofit your home that way. One thing you can do is come up with what we call the cost neutral point. And here's how it works. And let's take an example of a new home, but you can use the same argument for financing improvements in an existing home. If you're building a new house and you put energy conserving features into it, that will increase the cost of the house and increase the monthly payment that you make for your mortgage. On the other hand, you're saving on your utility bill. Well, if you start with a conventional house and you add the most cost-effective measures, for example, roof insulation or better windows, what you'll find is that your net monthly bill, which is a combination of your utility bill and your monthly mortgage payment, will drop as you add these energy-conserving features. You eventually reach a point where that hits a minimum, and now the features that you're adding are more expensive. Maybe a triple-pane window is more expensive than R40 roof insulation. And so that curve starts to come up. Well, eventually you reach a point where your monthly payment, your net monthly payment, mortgage and the utility bill, gets back to where you were at the beginning. That's called the cost neutral point. So at that point, in terms of your homeowner, your monthly bill, you see no change in your monthly bill, and your house might use 50% as much energy as it did otherwise. And so if we just built homes according to this cost neutral point, you can argue, gosh, we're saving half our energy at no cost. And then later you can add PV and you can march up that curve and eventually go to a zero net energy building. So everybody's talking zero net energy building. That's great. I'm proud of the fact that we have one in NREL now, but you don't have to do that. There's a path to zero net energy that can make a lot of sense from a cost standpoint.
And this brings me on to another question, actually, which I'm going to direct at Martha, because you, again, of this large footprint you have. One of the things that I'm interested in as well is that how do we think about buildings not as individual entities, but as part of an ecosystem? Because, for example, I mean, if you talk about green roofs, I think it was Toronto did a study showing that if 10% of the flat roofs in Toronto were green, you would lower the temperature in the summer by about 2 or 3 degrees. Now, that's a collaborative effect. If one building does it, it makes no difference. I mean, you save a little bit you get a bit of insulation on the building and it protects your roof, and there are lots of good reasons for green roofs. But this big one requires participation of everybody. Another point would be that, there's some legislation in the UK now which is promoting, you're giving tax relief for people who want to put a micro wind turbine on top of a large commercial building. Some people argue that actually it would be much better to use that money and build a community turbine that 10 buildings could tap into. When you're dealing with a large groups of buildings, how can you collaborate? How can you join the dots up?
Well, the best example of this, of course, outside Washington, D.C. is the Denver Federal Center, where we have an enormous footprint there and a lot of different agencies, and there is a lot of effort going on to do composting and waste and photovoltaics and so on, so it can be distributed across the whole complex. So that's a very sort of specific campus kind of approach. In many of these cities, I think the role that GSA can play, and we are very conscious of the communities we're going into, because we do set markets. We're so big, you just march in and inevitably, you're shaking up something. So we have to be very intentional about what we're doing. And it starts with the community and a lot of the interaction and the design and the conversation that needs to go on at the beginning. But we really, aside from actually going into a city and building a big federal building and having that kind of impact, I mean, we have 1 million square feet in 40 cities. So, in and of itself, we can probably affect some of the performance statistics of that downtown. But it does need to be collaborative. It needs to be thoughtful, and we have a real trade-off right now. We have a tremendous amount of inventory that the president is interested in having us maybe move out so that we can get some revenues from. But we also are an organization that can invest in the long run in a different way than the private sector. We don't flip our buildings every 5 years. When we build courthouses, believe me, we're building them for the long haul. And so our ROI and our sense of when we want to move buildings back into the private sector is part of that conversation. Should we hold a property because down the road it might be more important to be using in another way, and we have a longer view. So we just come at this orthogonally. And there is the power of modeling, huge power of modeling. For me to drive around in a hybrid and turn in my big old black Crown Vic is, I drive up to meetings with, cabinet people or DepSecs. There are only big black Crown Vics around in my little, green car. It's great. It's great. They're like, I keep telling them, you want to be secure, drive around in Washington in a small gray car. Don't drive around in a big old Crown Vic. They know that's the Army secretary. Kind of get that. So the modeling is big, and we can create a fair amount of buzz by trying on things. The San Francisco Federal Building, a very interesting big building, downtown San Francisco, built with a tremendous sensitivity around sustainability. No HVAC. There's no air conditioning in the building because we built it along the terms that we used to build federal buildings around, which was before air conditioning. You had policies that were like snow days for heat days. If it's a hot day, stay home. And that is, again, the human system around these buildings, which I think is also something we can model a tremendous amount around.
Yeah. David, I mean, you're dealing with a big community project. What are the possibilities that you find for this type of collaboration between, buildings sharing resources?
Oh, I think it's a huge issue, and I think one of the concerns, there are two concerns. One theoretical, if I can just detour 1 second. David Owen, who's here at the conference, I don't see him in the room right now. David, are you here? He wrote an article in the New Yorker, I think it was last December, on the Jevons paradox. And Jevons paradox all of you know, is just where you make savings, but then you plow the savings back into more energy consumption. And John Jevons wrote this part of the book he wrote called The Coal Paradox way back when. And David's article in December kicked off a lot of discussion. Some of you probably were involved in that, about the rebound effect. And it's a real issue, because if you step back from buildings and say the problem is not buildings per se, it's the carbon diet of the planet, then if you're saving money in buildings, but then you're using the money to go for more vacations on, and so forth, the net is going to be negative. And so there are a couple ways to deal with this. One is to take the savings from green buildings or whatever and bury the savings in your backyard. That's one way to do it. Another way is to invest in something other than the carbon-based economy, in solar and wind and so forth. But there's a theoretical issue here of how do you actually divert the savings in a way that doesn't compound the problem. On the issue, on the question, I think one of the concerns is we're not going to build our way out of this. So Martha's comments about more density in buildings and changing behavior patterns, I think, is really a big key. And it's beginning to figure out, okay, how do we occupy the existing buildings more effectively, more efficiently, and also, in a lot of ways, more convivially. So the experience of being in a building and with your fellow workers and so forth is not a hassle, and that's an interior design issue. But I think there's a lot of work on that, and people understand, I think, more about how to occupy places effectively, efficiently, gracefully, and graciously. And I think we're working now on one large project in Oberlin, the Green Arts District, which is going to be the driver for the local downtown economy. And it consists of a major art program, a major art museum, generally one of the top 5 on U.S. college campuses, a performing arts center, a hotel, and then other facilities. And so the design team is trying to find all the ways in which those spaces can be shared. And in some ways, it means extending the workday. So some people are in the building, 9 to 5 or whatever, and then the building shifts uses and occupants from 5 to 10 or whatever it might be. But creative thinking about how we occupy our places. So I don't have an answer for that except stay tuned. We're working on that. And I think people are understanding that it's not only cost effective, it also changes something about the dynamic and the personality of the places in which we work and the institutions that pay our bills.
Get people talking to each other.
Yeah, exactly right. There's an American concept.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
One of the other aspects of this notion about how do you use a building, it's really something that's so interesting to me, because in the federal inventory, we have buildings that really have to speak to the mission of the agency. And we build border stations. They're called land ports of entry. We build and renovate them, and we have lots of them. And they're much more noticed these days as we think about our borders, and especially with Mexico. But those, for example, are often remote, and it really argues for some sort of a self-standing, sustainable design, because who wants to be hauling fuel back and forth and so on? And it goes to the Navy, and the Navy's mission needs to support life and not put so many people in danger shipping fuel around. So the mission of these agencies is also driving our design thinking about how we supply, workspaces for them.
Is that true of schools, Rachel? I mean, schools are, obviously planted right in the middle of the community and a part of it. Are you finding opportunities to work with local shops, local businesses?
Yeah, I think it's one of the more interesting outgrowths of the Green Schools movement is this concept of joint use facilities. And really, schools were one of the original adopters of this concept of joint use out of necessity. So many schools truly are the centers of community. They're the only place where you can go in a natural disaster. They're the only place that can accommodate a town hall meeting. They're the only places that have a space that's large enough for the Girl Scouts convening. So when we launched Lead for Schools in 2007, we introduced this credit called Joint Use of Facilities. And at the time, we really thought of it as a credit that rewarded schools for a very sustainable behavior that many of them were already exhibiting. But what we've seen come out of it is interesting. It's people being much more intentional about how they plan on using a particular space and setting it up so that it's safe, setting it up so that their community can truly come in and engage within the space. And it's been tremendously successful, especially in urban areas where spaces, it's been, I think, most successful at the extremes. In urban areas where space is at a premium, you've got students who can walk from school to aftercare, in a place that's providing a safe and welcoming environment for them, where these parents had no place to send their kids before that was created. But in rural areas, it's been really interesting too, and the community education and engagement that comes out of it is one of the most interesting things. So in rural communities, the education around sustainability is happening in the schools as people come through for various different events and happenings. And there was a green school that was built in Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, and they wanted to figure out a way to get the community into the building to really learn about what was going on and what was sustainable. And so they decided to host an event to do help people create vermicomposting bins for their houses. And they thought they'd have like a couple dozen families show up, and they had 650 people show up over the course of 2 days to engage in this. And it's giving communities an opportunity to engage in a dialogue that's very personal to them. I mean, it's about their kids, it's about their kids' health, but it's also about the things that are most meaningful to them. And in a rural environment, that may be worms and dirt and plants, and in an urban environment, it may be a conversation about solar. It also may be the first time that a child has ever actually put his or her hands in dirt. We find that a lot of these edible schoolyards and community gardens that are happening in school environments, we hear from kids that it's the first time they've actually ever engaged with nature. So it's kind of, it's been, I think, one of the most beautiful outgrowths, and in the best of scenarios, it happens at the beginning. It happens at the inception of the project. And I think that goes back to what you were talking about, the different aspects of green beyond just energy, because I think that the biggest victory of the green building movement has been in advancing the concept of integrated design and the idea that you need to bring all of your decision makers around a table to make decisions. So you're engaging the community early on, you're engaging parents early on, you're engaging school administrators. And so for the first time, rather than being asked, do you want the green roof or the red roof, a principal is being asked, or a superintendent is being asked, do you want to preference energy savings or indoor air quality? And where shall we focus our time and attention? So I think it's helped people to have a really clear and meaningful conversation about what they want out of a school and a community space.
Which goes back to what we were saying about all getting to talk to each other. This may be one of the positives of this whole movement that we should focus on. On that note, I'm actually going to get you guys all talking to us. So if you would like to pose your questions to the panel, I don't know if we have a microphone or going around. Oh, there we go, yeah. If you'd like to go up to the microphone with your questions.
Hi, I'm Emily Siddiq from Alameda County, actually General Services Agency in California. And we spend a lot of time on employee education of our 9,000 employees around how to work effectively in buildings and reduce energy use. And you've all alluded to training, Rachel, in terms of the teachers, how do they work with the heating systems, and Martha, perhaps educating the managers how to manage a results-oriented work environment where their employees aren't right in front of them. So I'd love to hear you all talk about the kind of training that's most effective and needed for these kind of new buildings.
I want you to know there's federal legislation that has passed that is in setting up education for building managers. And this is really important. We have very, very complex airplanes, we have very complex ships, we have very complex institutions, and we educate and train the people that run those institutions. Building managers, somehow we think, they go in the basement and they kind of sweep up around the janitorial sort of thing, and they kind of maybe paint it's a really diminished view of managing a very complex and highly capital-intensive structure. Building managers are, my heroes. They really have a very complex job to do. And just to give you a sense of, how complex it is, you're trying to manage a building, everybody's fussing about the temperature in the building. Every day you set thermostats, you try to keep all of the chillers going and all of that, and every day a couple hundred little heaters walk into the building and walk around the building and change the dynamics of the heat in the building, and you're the building manager trying to manage this. We are on the edge of developing curriculum and being very intentional about building this profession so that we are operating these complex structures with the data, with the technology, and with the cultural expectations that are being placed on these building managers. It's a really interesting time.
When we, 10 years ago, when we opened the Lewis Center, we found out that the transition was a major transition. And the question here is so good. Thanks for asking it. The difference, in a way, was the difference between having a bunch of computers as opposed to typewriters. They both turn out paper with symbols on it, but a typewriter needs a little bit of oil and a ribbon change, and a computer needs software and networking and so forth. Totally different thing. And so high-performance buildings required a mind shift that was very dramatic on the part of the people who are in charge of maintaining buildings. Then it required a major shift, if it's done right, on the part of occupants. So they're living in a very different kind of environment, and you've got to thoughtfully engage it. Windows open or don't open, and the controls may or may not be automatic and so forth. There's a third change here, which is the finance people and the way the administration and the owners of the buildings actually see these, because they have now a very different product. It isn't just they have a building of one type or another, it's they have a very different kind of instrument. And so done right, and what we tried to do in the Lewis Center was to make it a pedagogical kind of thing. I hate the word, it sounds like a foot disease, but do you have pedagogy? Yeah, but I'm taking something for it, But the issue for the institution was, can you use green buildings to change not just how we live and occupy spaces, but how we think about our relationship with those spaces and those spaces to the larger world. So buildings that are done right, I think, become very instructive. And so it's not just the hardware. In some ways, you do want the building to report back to you. When we opened the Lewis Center, thanks to help from NREL, we had a class that was on high-performance building monitoring. And we strung out 160 data sensors in the building, and there's a flat screen display. The students that worked on that morphed into a company called Lucid Designs out in Oakland. And they're now a big deal in the high-performance building monitoring thing. But the idea is make buildings educational.
So, Chuck.
I'd like to say that I think educating the employees on how to live in these new, more dense spaces makes a lot of sense, and there's certainly plenty of advantages to those spaces, as we discussed. But also, I think it's important to learn from the employees. And what we're doing at NREL is we're building these new buildings, and again, we're trying to get out of leased office space, which has cost the government lots of money over the years. So it makes sense from that standpoint to have our own buildings. But we're trying to learn from each building by getting feedback from the users. So, for example, the building I'm in right now is a sort of more traditional office building that was reconfigured for this more dense environment, more daylighting, open cubicles, and that sort of thing. We have huddle rooms. You go into the huddle rooms if you need to have a private conversation. Well, I can tell you, it's pretty hard to find an available huddle room. When you need one, they're full. Well, that information is being fed forward to the next building. How many huddle rooms do we really need? Typically, and I'm an engineer, so I'm guilty of this, we build these energy efficient buildings. We instrument the hell out of them. I mean, in this new RSF building, there's thermocouples all over the place. The guys in the commercial buildings group can tell you, well, the lights are supposed to go off at night, but you know what? The cleaning crew's coming in and they're leaving the lights on too long, okay? They have all this information. But what we also need is we need information feedback from the comfort and the experience of the users, and not enough has been put on that. All the information has been looking at energy use. I saw a very interesting presentation that I like to recommend to you. I was at the World Renewable Energy Congress in Abu Dhabi last September, and there was a professor from Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. His name is George Baird, and he has a book called Sustainable Buildings in Practice, What the Users Think. It's a 2010 book, and he looked at 30 case studies. And he went to all these sustainable buildings, great new sustainable buildings. They all have awards of one sort or another. This RSF I'm talking about, I think it has 10 awards. But he looked at these award-winning buildings, and instead of looking at the energy, he interviewed the occupants. He sent questionnaires out. He got feedback, what they like, what they don't like. I think we need to do more of that and feed that forward into new building design. So, for example, noise was a big issue with these people. glare. In the RSF, we have ways to reflect the light onto the ceiling. But there are still hot spots on walls and things that bother people. It's in their peripheral vision. So there's things like that that you may not think of. And so I think we need to do a better job of getting feedback from the occupants and include that in future designs.
And I would say one piece of feedback is if you're designing a building, certainly from my perspective, I don't know about you guys, but make the lighting flattering in the toilets. It makes your day feel a lot better if you look good in the mirror when you go to the bathroom.
Can I say one thing here? There's an issue here of what a high-performance building is. And if we're really good, there's a paradox here, isn't there? That you make buildings so attractive and so cool that we stay in those buildings and they mimic the natural world, biomimicry and so forth. And we never get to the outside world because it's so cool inside the building. So this is not without some paradox. And if I had to list my favorite green buildings, it wouldn't be the one that we did at Oberlin, the ones we've done at Oberlin. It would be Aldo Leopold's shack, which is a converted chicken coop in which he wrote Sand County Almanac. Now that is a high-performance building. And it's just a converted chicken coop. So if you measure what the human effect is in buildings, and that's only partially tongue-in-cheek, then there's a different way to see this. And there is a paradox of making buildings so seductive. And one other point, are there some things that ought to happen in dark, dank, miserable, energy-inefficient surroundings? And maybe consumption is one of those.
Interesting idea.
Anyway, just a thought.
We have another question.
Yeah, one of the questions that the blurb for the session also raised at the end was green buildings versus urbanism. And I wanted to kind of expand on that and broaden out a little bit. The question of net zero, there are certain folks, I'm Ellen Dunham-Jones and teach at Georgia Tech, and I'm also on the board of Congress for the New Urbanism. And so when I'm hanging around with a lot of the urbanists, folks basically will say, you can't have a net zero building if you've got a parking lot, period. You've already, the recent report from EPA that Jonathan Rose companies did, called it, that the subtitle is something about it boils down to BTUs. They looked at, and pretty crude measures, but just average home BTU, roughly 100 million. Average car, roughly 100, driving 17,000 miles, vehicle miles traveled, approximately 100 million BTU. Basically, the average, if you then look at, okay, let's do green construction on the home, drive a Prius, whatever, green home, green car is still not as efficient as average home, average car, but located next to transit, located in a walkable environment. And then they went through a whole bunch of other kinds of comparisons. But that larger, looking at the ecosystem in terms of really considering the role of transportation being one of the most vital, with that, I wanted to sort of just bring that up. The notion of location efficiency is gaining a lot of ground. We've got more and more information to be able to actually measure that and stuff. And specifically ask Rachel, with the green schools, is the USGBC trying to challenge some of the state school site acreage requirements? I can't think of one other factor that is as much of a driver of sprawl as the school site acreage requirements. When they require that schools have to have a minimum of 40 acres, it drives the schools out to the cheap land that they can assemble out at the edge. The rooftops follow. Families feeling they have to educate their kids at the newest, best schools are going out to the edge, and that's why you're getting all the SUVs dropping the kids off. Now that nobody walks to school anymore. All of those compounded effects.
Right. So there's three ways that we're working on that at USGBC and within the center. One is via LEED certification, and it has more to do with incentivizing good behavior rather than penalizing for bad behavior. And when LEED 2009 went through the re-weightings process, what you saw was the number of credits or points associated with transportation, for instance, and the siting of a school facility or any other type of building that was pursuing certification go from like this to like this, because of the carbon impact and the energy impact associated with, with siting issues and how people are getting to and from. The second way that we're addressing it, and I think it's a more challenging conversation, is through our work with state legislators. And we have a program called the 50 for 50 Green Schools Caucus Initiative, where we are now working with groups of state legislators in about 35 states to advance their knowledge of green schools and green buildings and greener communities, and then help them to identify where legislative shifts need to happen. And it's been, I think, on the whole, tremendously successful, because it's helped these very under-resourced state legislators who are asked to be generalists, just like a member of Congress, but have no staff, they don't get paid, they don't have a full grasp of the issues. You know, we've had situations where prior to conversations with legislators, they're wanting to adapt some of these school siting requirements. So whether it's the amount of acreage or the place where the school is sited, but we're making that shift in legislation in a vacuum, because we forget that schools often don't have a choice as to where they're going to build. They get gifted by developers who want to, build a massive new development way far out. So they give schools this very desirable plot of land, and it's free, and the schools don't have any other choice. So we're trying to work with legislators to take really smart approaches to what those policies look like, so that they don't disadvantage schools in a moment when they can't afford that, but are making much smarter decisions around things like siting. And then the third and final way that we're doing it, and the one that I personally think has been most effective, is we're empowering volunteers within communities. So we've got green school committees that sit in our local chapters across all 50 states. And the best example is a gentleman named Jason Gamache. He lives in Alaska, in Anchorage, and he was instrumental in helping the Anchorage School District pass a Green Schools resolution that requires LEED for all their new construction projects. There was a development, he lives in a development where they were considering awarding a plot of land to the Anchorage School District to build a green school. And there was some backlash from the community saying, like, we can't possibly build this school because there's this pond right next door and the building's going to mess all of that up, and so forth and so on. And Jason basically, as wearing his hat as a parent, but also as a volunteer and an architect within the community, helped them to understand that Anchorage, their commitment to sustainability meant that siting it there was going to be a more walkable solution, but also that it wouldn't be harming the land that school was resting on, but rather rehabilitating it. So that's kind of been, I think, the most effective as we're working from the top down at the federal or the state level. The bottom-up grassroots advocacy has been probably more impactful than anything in terms of motivating change.
One quick follow-up that you just might suggest, I'm hearing more and more people at least talking about, is towns that say they don't have transit. I turn around and say, do you have school buses? Mm-hmm. You've got an underperforming transit system, use it. Mm-hmm. It's the same issue as the underused buildings.
Yeah, I think you raise an absolutely crucial point. Like probably a lot of us here, I own a Prius. It takes me 10 minutes to drive my Prius to work. 30 years ago, I made the decision to buy a house right next to NRELM. So it takes me, it takes me 8 minutes to drive to work. It takes me 10 minutes to walk to work, because I can cut through these streets that I can't drive on. So I can actually walk to work almost as fast as I can drive to work, and that's much more energy efficient, obviously, than even driving the Prius. If you look at New Yorkers are among the most energy efficient people in the world. I mean, a lot of New Yorkers don't even own cars. They use public transit. There you go. Back at the end of World War II, when Levitt and his cohorts came back, and they started picturing Levittown and suburbia, the car companies thought, what a great idea. Let's put people outside the cities, and they'll drive back and forth to work every day. From an energy standpoint, it's a horrible way to go. And I think that we really need to reinvestigate this whole way that we're doing our living. And you're right, it's not enough to keep the suburban living and just, make these incremental changes, essentially what we're doing. We really have to start looking at more efficient living, where people are living close to work, where we're using public transit. We need to use that much more effectively, where we're telecommuting more. So yeah, it's more than just building energy efficient buildings. I think we have to be smarter about the whole infrastructure, the whole way that we live and work.
Just really, Ellen, the question's a great question. Thanks for asking. It also gets us real quickly into politics, because when the Levittowns were built and the suburbs began to sprawl, we built a massive infrastructure. It included oil companies, road building companies, car companies, and so forth, and they've had a stranglehold on U.S. policy ever since.
Absolutely.
And so the big change here is going to have to be political. Sometime sooner or later, we were going to have to win these battles to turn a lot of that around. But your question is really a good question.
I'm going to go for one more question.
Hi, I'm Jesse Morris with the Rocky Mountain Institute. David, I just had a question for you. You said that for either neutral buildings or net zero buildings, the technology and the economics are there. I agree with you depending on how you do your spreadsheet. I'd push you a little on the finance question. So I was wondering if I'd just ask a quick question about finance. Some of our work now, we're looking at trying to hit that 350 parts per million point by 2050. And since buildings use 43% of our energy, we need to be retrofitting thousands of buildings a day, starting really in the next few years. And I agree with you, economics and technology, but really, how do we free up the capital to try and get it to those mom and pop homes in the Southeast that have the highest carbon footprints to really get that going?
Well, Jesse, really good question. And nice to hear from RMI folks. I think a good bit of this goes back to some of the comments that have been made here on the panel. If you begin to look at macro scale stuff, and Amory was one of the people who way back when, decades ago, began to point out that we were spending on security something like, and I forgot the exact number, it was around $15,000 a second. But just take, you do the math on that, but that's a lot of money. And that meant that we had to have an umbilical cord that goes out to the Middle East, and to protect that umbilical cord, you had to have the Sixth Fleet, and we fought a whole bunch of wars over there to protect that. So that has to be, if we're logical about this, we start adding up these costs. And we now maintain a military budget, if you add up everything, it's about $1.2 trillion per year. There's a defense budget and warfighting authorizations and all this other stuff you get added to it. So if you just say, if we were to do full cost appraisal at a macro scale, the money is there. We're not a poor country. We're not as wealthy as we thought we were because we just pushed this bow wave of debt off on us, carbon being one of the bigger ones. We're just offload those costs on other people. But I think the issue for us in the open project, when you get down, after all the abstractions, you get down to ground level, it's okay, how do you begin to finance things? Businesses for years have been doing things like, if you create a stream of value into the future, and you know you're going to save X millions of dollars in the future, discount that back to net present value, then borrow against that sum to begin to finance that. Now that requires a shift in the way we think about loaning money and we think about cost. But there's no good economics that doesn't begin to widen those boundaries of consideration. That's why in this conversation, the discussion strayed back and forth across this boundary. If the analysis stops at the skin of a building, you've missed something really big. You got to widen the boundaries of consideration. You got to get out to the parking lots and the cars and transportation stuff, and all the asphalt that you have to have for roadways to move people around and get the goods and so forth in. So you widen the boundaries of consideration out, and it becomes a very different kind of issue. But if you finance this, if I could be king for about 1 hour, I'd say that the Pentagon budget ought to be cut dramatically because it's not making us safer. It's kind of like those Black Crown Vics. It's a big bullseye on us. The Pentagon budget is one big part of that. Tax breaks for wealthy people are another part of it. But now you're into the messy realm of politics. But we're spending a lot of money. There was a study done years ago by a British ecologist on all the taxes and all the things that we support that we really don't want, don't need, and So you added up all the subsidies for things like forestry, road building, overfishing, and so forth, and the subsidies, I've forgotten the exact number, but it was well up into the trillions. And that was a global number. In the United States, all the number we spent on fossil fuel plants and so forth and so on. But eventually, I want to go back to about 40,000 feet. This requires a change in the way we do governance, the way we conduct the public business. And sooner or later, we're going to have to get in the messy realm of politics. Government, if I take the way ecosystems work over here, they're holistic and so forth, and they're long-term. But governance is fragmented short-term. And that was the way Madison et al. Created it, and it's a system of checks and balances, and that has its upside. But there was a different theory of governance embedded in the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. It talked about holism and long-term and looking at alternatives and beginning to price things. But that's a very fertile question. Thanks for asking it. The money is there. I think it requires, however, that we rethink a good bit of how we conduct the public business. Because otherwise, we're going to be nickel-diming solutions. And if I take a nickel-dime, and we're making, if we had 100 years, I'd be incredibly optimistic in nickel-dime solutions. But the climate data doesn't give us that time. Time is the one thing we don't have. The IEA report, the International Energy Agency report last week that we're coming out, we now cannot avoid a 2 degrees centigrade warming. And that is bad news. That is, according to all the climate scientists you and I would talk to, that is the threshold of bad things happening. That doesn't mean everything on the other side of 2 degrees or up to 2 degrees is safe. That's not it at all, given that 30-year lag what comes out of our tailpipes and smokestacks and the climate change-driven weather effects that we see. But I think it's going to require eventually that we overcome, and I think there's enough convergence between right and left that we can actually get there. But thanks for that question.
You have very, very quickly, and then I'll squeeze just one more in because I was told till 11:30.
I just wanted to say there's no dearth of people out there that are very creative thinkers that come up with very interesting financing schemes. And one of my favorite is, whether you assess the property tax. This is done in Boulder and other communities. You put a PV system on a home, it'll last 25 years, but the average home ownership is much shorter than that. So what do you do about that? Well, you increase the property tax of that house in order to pay for that PV system, and that increased property tax over the length of the PV will pay for that, and that property tax sticks with the house. So you can have multiple owners of that house, but that property tax is paying for that PV system. I think that's a very innovative financing scheme, and I think, again, there's plenty of ideas out there. We just need to be willing to accept some of these new ideas.
Yeah, I think the financial sector has a huge role to play. Let's just get one very quick question in.
Yeah, hi, Rob Kunzig of National Geographic. This is a question for Martha, I think, picking up on something you said about your strategy at GSA. I've been reading about the history of cities a lot lately, and the thing about a lot of the features we're struggling with now, like the suburbs, is they seem like a good idea at the time, right? If you go back and read the things that people were writing then, they weren't idiots. So that's made me start to think about the conversations we're having now and start to think about, well, what ideas are we having now seem like a good idea at the time but might have consequences. And when I hear you say you're going to triple the density at GSA and tell people that they're not going to have personal space at work and maybe they shouldn't even come to work, I'm wondering what kind of effect is that going to have on people's relation to work? And I'm speaking as someone who's telecommuted a lot, who now has a nice office at National Geographic that I like very much. And, it just sounds like something like, and as Chuck was saying, how's that going to affect, if we change people's attitudes towards going to work, that might be a big unintended consequence.
That is exactly the role we need to be playing. What you don't want to do is have this experiment going across the whole government until you've got some data and some experience inside government. So in some ways, I see GSA as a lab. It's a new concept for us because we're very operational, but we do need to practice and try these things. And so I think pushing the limit in terms of thinking about our own building and what we can and can't do. And believe me, we're loudly listening to everybody, and everybody's loudly talking to me. I talk about the emails from the gulag that I get, and we have to be in very, very open conversation. It is not, it does not pass me up as almost ironic that the president has asked us to lead on sustainability, but also to lead on open government. We need to be very open about this. We need to share our data. We need to talk about it as we're going through it. I find the government tends to talk about a lot of things without doing it. We plan, we create scenarios. We're in a position where we can actually try it out and be that kind of model. Those are very real questions, very real questions. And as a person who has both a gigantic historic office and now a cubicle, I get to talk about those experiences with people and say, come on, let's kind of keep moving here. I think the big questions are generational, actually. How the silverbacks deal with this workspace as opposed to the younger generation is what we need to watch. I'm also aware of the fact that there's so many anecdotes, but we moved out of that building. You have no idea how many hoarders we had at GSA. And you do have to, I believe very deeply, you need to interrupt behaviors, not disrupt behaviors. If you interrupt people a little bit here and a little bit there, and you talk about it a lot and everybody gets to see it, you'll create more awareness, knowledge, useful information, and change. If I go slamming and disrupting, that doesn't work. I get huge blowback, it all falls apart. So we are trying to find a line. We call this the extreme challenge. For GSA, it's a very important signature project because we've always been in the background and we've always been beat up and we've always been told, we're just the facilities people. So for us to step out and do something really zippy like this is very interesting. And also we go to see Google, we go to see our supply base. A lot of people with interesting ideas in the private sector we can watch and say, gosh, why can't we be like that? So I'm playing with a number of different things here, and you're absolutely right. We should not be arrogant, and we absolutely can't be unintentional about this. We have to talk about it and be very open about it.
I'm going to wrap it up now because I think we're running over time, but thanks so much to all of you on the panel, and thanks to you guys for coming.